very warm welcome to everyone on behalf of the British Psychotherapy Foundation for this Zoom event. Elizabeth will be speaking later on in the course of the day. She's a BPF psychoanalytic psychotherapist, and her own book, The Petrified Ego, was published in 2014 by Carnac, based on her doctoral thesis, The Structuring Function of the Superego. She consults on career development, and her clinical experience of the debilitating impact of the overcritical conscience informs the psychoanalytic model she's designed to help individuals fulfill their potential at work. So Elizabeth will be talking in response to Celia. And Celia Harding, who we're particularly pleased to welcome after this long delay to put this event on, has worked as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist in private practice in East London for over 30 years. Celia is a founder member of the Association for Psychotherapy in East London, and she edited Sexuality, Psychoanalytic Perspectives in 2001, and Aggression and Destructiveness in 2006. She supervises, consults, and she teaches, and as we're pleased to say, she's written and edited this the book, which is the subject of our talk today, Dissecting the Superego. So it's great pleasure to hand over to Celia, and the rest of us can be silent, and we will have a little pause at the end of her talk. Okay.
Thank you. Just want to say it's great to see you here today, and I wish we could be speaking and discussing. I could be speaking to this to you in person, and that we could be discussing it in person. But let's hope we still can get lots out of it. So, my title is What Has Become of the Superego in Our Selfie Society? Narcissus famously wasted away, enthralled by his own reflection, oblivious to any needs of other. In a more recent version of this sorry tale, we learned that selfies can be dangerous. People have become so engrossed in arranging their image to take a selfie in a hazardous place that they have fallen to their deaths or serious injuries. And these beg the question, whatever happened to the Uber-Ich, the benign, protective, and the critical punitive functions of the superego at such moments? In 1931, Freud wrote that if he'd worked exclusively with narcissistic libidinal types, he would never have discovered the superego. In narcissistic states of mind and character, we might be forgiven for assuming that moral functions are either switched off or non-existent. I'm more inclined to suggest that superego activities in narcissistic contexts have distinctive configurations, roles, and functions, more akin to malfunction than non-existence. And Tim's going to look at figure one. And this shows my working model of superego components in relatively healthy superego functioning. In my introduction to the book, I suggest these components work together like the musicians in a musical quartet to regulate relations within the mind and between self, others, and external realities. Now, if we compare this with figure 2, so if we compare the first one with this second one, someone in a narcissistic state of mind deploys these components of their moral faculties to exert control over others and the world in order to maintain their narcissistic equilibrium. So the operative distinction is the difference between control in narcissism and regulating relationships in healthier superego functioning. So turning to the book, Dissecting the Superego, Moralities under the Psychoanalytic Microscope. In part 1, we explore theories of the development of morality. In part 2, we explore superego functioning in different states of mind. And in part 3, we focus on superego functioning in clinical training and practice. Today, I want to draw out an implicit and unifying thread underlying every chapter of this book, the functioning of the superego in various narcissistic states of mind and character. And this particular focus seems to me to be a given when we consider Marianne Parsons' 2009 observation that the dual role of the superego is to regulate the expression of our impulses and derivatives thereof, and our narcissistic strivings and needs. Narcissism, morality, and self-preservation. You may be relieved to hear that I'm not going to attempt to take us through the labyrinth of theories of narcissism that have been proposed over the years. Rather, I will focus on the fragility of the ego, which underlies narcissistic states of mind and character. In narcissistic states, there's only room for one. If me, then you do not exist. If you, then I do not exist. And that's Brenman, 2006. When an other threatens a person with a fragile ego, they reflexively deploy moral functions as a heavy-handed substitute for the ego strengths they lack as a consequence of developmental deficit. So turning to part 1 of the book, Bob Hinshelwood opens it with his account of the infant's moral development from a Kleinian perspective. He describes how the infant's incipient ego gradually begins to differentiate between pleasure and unpleasure. As the baby's forming ego develops, unpleasure becomes overlaid with connotations of badness and pleasure with goodness. When the infant's development takes place in a facilitative, maturational environment, the infant can begin to differentiate between internal and external reality. External reality, he suggests, can serve as the lifeboat, which can rescue the child from drowning in his/her sense of being irredeemably morally bad, helpless to protect his good objects from the danger that his bad feelings and impulses pose to his loved ones. Darcia Narvaez writes about the development of morality from a neurobiological psychological perspective. In their primary relationships, fortunate infants encounter caregivers who are able to regard and love their infants as incipient little people in their own right. These caregivers can help their infant to develop their individuality within the context of their early relationships. As the infant's individuality is nurtured, their neuronal potential to develop as a social being is simultaneously activated and established. Here it's important to observe, we are social because we are moral, and moral because we are social. Such fortunate children will be likely to develop a moral compass based on what Narvaez describes as a companionship ethic. Tragically, not all infants develop within such healthy relationships. Rather, they are obliged to suppress their own narcissistic needs and impulses in order to secure their caregiver's love and attention. In short, these infants are required to relate to mother as her narcissistic object. In these relationship conditions, both individual ego and social development are likely to be compromised. These children are likely to struggle with deficient ego resources and may resort to structuring and organizing their experience by moral functions in lieu of ego defenses and capacities. Such unfortunate children are likely to be sharing the same tragic conditions as their caregivers had to contend with in their development. They are liable to develop what Narvaez describes as a self-protective ethic. Their moral functioning is oriented to their own psychic survival. They are likely to lack the neuronal and psychological wherewithal to relate with other people as other, only as extensions of self. They're liable to treat other people as existing to serve their narcissistic needs as they serve their caregivers' needs. Most vitally, to make themselves feel as if always powerful and in control and never dangerously vulnerable and helpless. This perspective chimes with Anne Horn's beautifully crafted chapter on the development of the ego ideal. Children not raised in a facilitative, maturational environment are unlikely to receive the help they need to modify their ideals and goals for themselves in line with the reality of who they are becoming and of what they are capable of achieving. Instead, they develop ideal egos, built on omnipotent expectations of their capacities and abilities. Their fragile egos acquire precarious strength by identifying with their ideal egos. So we're going to look at the figure 2 on the screen again. While someone with a fragile ego feels secure in their identification with their ideal ego, their narcissistic equilibrium feels stable, and they experience no threat to their self-esteem and well-being. They are perfect as they are, and their objects and their world are experienced as behaving themselves, as one of my patients put it. That is, no threat, no disturbance, at one with her. The moral values and social rules by which human beings normally regulate their relationships with others lie dormant. Those values and rules only kick in, as it were, when the reality of other intrudes into the person's narcissistic bubble and punctures their ideal and grandiose assumptions about themselves. The person with a fragile ego reacts as if they are about to be eclipsed by the other, by reality, by not me. Self-preservative aggression is mobilized and channeled through their superego functions to obliterate the offensive, threatening reality in defense of their narcissistic equilibrium and of their psychic existence. And you'll recognize Glasser in that. This self-preservative rage is expressed through moral values and social rules which are weaponized, erupting in righteous fury or even violence. The narcissistically threatened person either targets themselves for their moral failure to live up to their ideal ego expectations, or they shoot the other or reality, maybe depersonalize it a bit, down in flames for morally failing them. For example, for unfairly treating them. I did not deserve this. To my mind, this makes sense of Freud's 1931 observation that superego functions seem absent in narcissistic states of mind and character. Turning to part 2 of the book, the role of superego functions in various narcissistic states of mind. Broadly speaking, I've been suggesting that the role of moral functions in narcissistic contexts is to buttress a fragile ego. In this figure, the distinctive features of superego functioning in the narcissistic states explored in the book are arranged grammatically. So in this next section of the paper, I'm following the chapters in the book, and I'll outline dynamics involving the superego and different narcissistic configurations: psychopathy, perversion, depression, petrified ego, borderline, and finally fundamentalist. At one extreme, we find amoral narcissism, or what looks like it. Although, as Kernberg, 1980, helpfully points out, people with narcissistic personalities are apparently charming and sociable, their sociality turns out to be skin deep, as it were. Relationships sustained through paying lip service to the social niceties, which oil the wheels of apparent relatedness to others. The superficiality of these attempts to relate to others is liable to come under stress and become difficult to sustain when an other reveals themselves as not at one with the narcissistic character. At this point, appearances of concern or respect for the other are liable to break down. The other's failure to fit in with a narcissistically vulnerable person disrupts their security and their well-being, and is liable to trigger moral outrage, either directed at the self for their apparent omnipotent failure, or at the other, or reality, for their moral failure to supply the fragile ego's narcissistic needs, which are experienced as entitlements, as rights, not as needs.
Can you see that now?
Yeah. Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
An apparently amoral position is epitomized in psychopathy, grading into narcissistic personality disorders, as Celia Taylor examines in chapter 8 in the book. She explores the evidence for the roots of psychopathic functioning, in which there is a profound lack of any sense of concern or respect for others. And she asks, is the psychopath born or made? She concludes the evidence is not clear. What is clear is that psychopathic individuals are likely to have experienced themselves as their mother's narcissistic objects. In particular, evidence suggests that mothers of psychopaths were likely to have attempted to regulate their own precarious narcissistic equilibrium by exerting control and power over their children as extensions of themselves, frequently through subjecting the child to gross humiliations. Children with such narcissistically dangerous experiences from their primary relationship are liable to relate to others as they were related to, as if pieces on the mother's chessboard. The purpose of others is to make the psychopath feel powerful and in control of self and other, so as to feel protected from the dangers of being vulnerable and helpless. Some psychopathic personalities are manifestly able to calculate other people's vulnerabilities, but they use their understanding to callously control them and reassure themselves of their own narcissistic safety at the expense of the other. Those with superego configurations characterized by problems of perversion are considered by Heather Wood in chapter 6. The ego fragility of these patients is manifested in core complex anxieties and deep-seated emptiness and depression. They manage threats to their narcissistic safety and well-being perversely with moral opprobrium structured within 4 types of internal object relationship. In the first, a sadistic malicious figure in the mind morally scrutinizes the ego and or the other in the relationship, for example, the therapist in the transference. In the second perverse internal relationship with a superego figure, the ego identifies with and takes on the position of a moral overseer of others, exercising what Wood calls a bogus morality in a vigilante style. In a third perverse relationship of fragile ego with a tyrannical moral scrutinizer, the ego tries to get under the radar of their moral function by turning their fear of being cruelly judged and punished into exciting deceit. The ego's moral failure is turned into a secret weapon and hidden. They get away with it and secretly triumph over their superego, related to as their sadistic torturer. Fourthly, the person may manage their pervasive sense of moral failure and inadequacy by confirming in action and fantasy their conviction of fundamental vileness. They put themselves socially beyond the pale, deriving sadomasochistic gratification from being punished for, and by punishing the self, as bad, wicked, and disgusting. Doing and being the worst by becoming and embodying the worst in the eyes of society is experienced as excited self-disgust. The person's shameful sense of moral failure is turned into excited shamelessness by sexualizing their anxiety about being rotten to the core, as a patient put it. In depressed narcissistic states, which I explore in chapter 4, superego functioning is characteristically murderous towards an ego deemed to have failed to live up to its unrealistic ideals. Following Freud's classic analysis, I see the ego as split between identifying with the morally failing object and with the perpetrator of moral retribution. My title, Sorry Never Made a Dead Man Alive, conveys the murderous absolutism and ruthlessness of this judge of moral failure in action, behind the hopelessness and worthlessness of the depressed ego. This ego does not have strength and resources to discriminate between the seriousness of its moral failures and shortcomings, to mourn the losses of omnipotence in the face of recognizing their limitations, or to imagine meaningful reparative possibilities that could facilitate self-forgiveness and moving on. Let me die is the only way out of this hell, alternating with manic defenses, perhaps with strongly perverse overtones of triumph over their self-murderous inclinations. In psychopathy, there is no room for other. In Elizabeth Redish's petrified ego, there is no room for self. The archaic superego, unchallenged, dominates an increasingly atrophying ego. In her new theory of conscience, Redish suggests that the superego's initial pre-Oedipal role in relation to the incipient ego has an organizing and a structuring function, enabling the regulation of response to stimuli, internal, for example, gut pain, or external, for example, extremes of temperature. The difference between safe and threatening experiences is determined. Stability, continuity, and thereby predictability of experience is established. Safe is good, threatening is bad, archaic morality, a primary dialectic. However, the ego must ultimately take up the mantle of what is in essence reality testing. Its growth is contingent upon wresting this function from the superego. If this does not happen, the ego remains dependent on an increasingly domineering and ultimately ego-destructive superego. Petrified in time and through fear, this fragile ego finds itself between the devil, with an exclusive absolutist view of the world, which must not be deviated from, and the deep blue sea, where it feels annihilatory anxiety at the very idea of thinking for itself. Patients frequently present with the problem of rumination, and this is a symptom of such annihilatory anxiety. The help and support of a therapist with a different view of the world and how things are and work is needed by the patient. Courage is needed to challenge this mental prison and resume growth. enormous courage. It's interesting to note that in the pre-Oedipal state, morality and reality are undifferentiated. In forging its identity through challenge of the early superego, the ego differentiates the two, allowing different moralities and realities to be tolerated. Jack Nathan explores the function of the superego in borderline states of mind. He argues that the therapist's primitive superego functioning is activated when the borderline patient becomes narcissistically threatened by the therapist's relating to him or her as other. He suggests that borderline defenses are a way of managing an acutely vulnerable and precarious narcissistic equilibrium for an ego rendered immensely fragile by experiencing in their early relationship a mother unable to tolerate her infant's unbearable states of mind. The infant is then inclined to experience themselves as a bad baby for demanding that mother satisfies their emotional or physical needs. Nathan summarizes the consequences thus: I am bad, severely persecuting superego, therefore I self-harm, punishment. I self-harm, therefore I am bad, severely persecuting superego. Alternatively, the infant experiences their mother, or in the transference their therapist, as the bad, projective identification rejecting object. Either way, infants with such cumulative experiences of their primary object do not have sufficient consistent experiences of a containing maternal object to internalize as a basis for a well-functioning ego development, and the capacity to internally process their experiences. Instead, persecuting elemental superego action replaces thought. When elemental superego forces are constellated between patient and therapist, the patient is likely to turn on the therapist with moral accusation in order to harm them for having failed them, or to turn their righteous fury on themselves in the form of self-harm, to punish themselves for being bad and demanding. Nathan suggests that the borderline patient is unconsciously waiting for the therapist to fail them by revealing themselves as a separate person who does not understand them. Their unconscious hope is that the therapist will take on board their hatred of their needy, demanding infantile self to relieve them of this terrible inner turmoil and rage. When the therapist fails to understand because their own elemental superego is triggered, the patient turns their superego dispositions driven by morally justified rage onto the therapist. The patient's defensive analyst constitutes a triumph for the patient in that the therapist can be seen as the failing object of their expectation, and giving them grounds to reinforce their justified grievance and victimhood. And finally, we consider the apparently hypermoral position of those with a fundamentalist moral functioning. Someone with a fragile ego is liable to have a very low tolerance of conflict and uncertainty. A fundamentalist mindset, enforced by superego processes, may become an unconsciously selected solution to buttress an ego too deficient in its own reality-related resources, to moderate and modify expressions of the person's impulses and derivatives thereof. Instead, as Leslie Merton argues in Chapter 9, the person's moral function is relied upon to provide a conviction of certainty and of rightness. Superego processes are called upon in a fundamentalist mindset to pronounce on what is good or bad, right or wrong, with absolute certainty. And since these judgments are regarded as certain, the person in a fundamentalist mindset is not interested in reality or evidence. The ideal ego of this superego is based on virtue and purity. Well-being and self-esteem are secured through virtuously adhering to avoiding the pleasures of gratified impulses unless these be heavily disguised and slipped under the tyrannical moral radar of fundamentalist rigor. Moral narcissism, explicated by Green in 1981, forms, in my view, the narcissistic foundation to fundamentalist states of mind. Then we turn to psychoanalytic relationships in the broader professional context, in the third part of the book, where our focus shifts to the therapist's own narcissistic strengths and weaknesses, and how these are regulated by professional codes of ethics and practice. This perspective takes us beyond the moral functioning of individuals in their immediate social spheres to consider the social context in which these relationships are situated. The therapist's ethical conduct of a therapeutic relationship is regulated by his or her observance of the professional standards of their professional bodies, which in turn are accountable to the society to which they belong. Chris Driver explores the ways professional codes of ethics and practice are internalized during an analytic therapist's training. Warren Coleman explores the individual practitioner's development of their analytic superego functions in the course of their practice as an analytic therapist. And I focus on the workings of therapists' superego functions as members of the psychoanalytic profession, regulating their narcissistic vulnerabilities as these are activated in their relationships with their patients. This concludes the scope of the book. Now I'd like to show how the richness of Freud's concept of the superego can enlighten our understanding of relationships between individuals and groups on social and political platforms within the society to which they belong. We are social because we are moral, and moral because we are social. Moral values are a product of our human biological evolutionary heritage. Human beings extend their capacities for survival and growth by forming groups and cooperating in pursuing their shared interests. Activities pursued and refined in the interests of the social grouping were regulated by increasingly sophisticated moral values, which formed the social glue which kept the majority of group members focused on furthering their common good. Such shared values include the care and protection of dependent and vulnerable others, fair and just treatment of one another to facilitate cooperation and discourage cheating and exploitation, trustworthiness, loyalty, and reliability in the exercise of tasks for the common good, respect for authorities and hierarchies to support leaders and their coordination of social roles in the interests of all, consensus as to how we secure individual and social hygiene in the interests of protecting each other from contamination by harmful substances and practices, and of course viruses. Respect for the freedoms and rights of others in order to check the inclination of a powerful few or many to dominate and exploit others. And it's Jonathan Haidt who has sorted all this out so clearly. However, as Freud was keenly aware, his concept of the superego refers to a fundamental conflict between the needs of the person in their own right and their social needs. Societies manage this conflict differently. Some societies prioritize the needs of the community and society as a whole over the rights and interests of individual members. Other societies prioritize the rights of individuals and their freedoms over and above social interests, provided that the individual's liberty to pursue their own interests does not compromise the safety, freedoms, and securities of others. Other societies defer to a divine order to adjudicate over the ways that relationships between members of society are organized. Individuals form societies by cooperating with one another to serve what are deemed by tacit consent to be common goods for the benefits of all members. These cooperative social relationships are regulated by moral values, codified into social rules, internalized by the members of that society. Freud expresses these kind of ideas in his concept of the superego as the representative of society, which Rickman described it as, in the individual's mind. Moral functions stand as a bridge between a person's individuality and their sociality. Social values transmitted by families via the socialization processes of childhood form the basis of the superego of individuals belonging to a society, regulating their expressions of their narcissistic needs, wishes, impulses, and affirming them as socially reputable members of their social groupings. In modern Western societies, priority has increasingly been granted to the rights of individual members to freely develop their autonomous selves, with the proviso that they pay equal concern, consideration, and respect for the fellow members of society to the same freedoms. In the 21st century, we find ourselves living in an extreme example of an individualistic society. And here we come full circle to the question of a selfie society. The very idea of a selfie society, especially in the context of moral function, seems like an oxymoron. A so-called selfie society apparently comprising individuals who regulate themselves and their relationships with others on a basis dominated by self-interest doesn't appear to convey much sociality. And from this point of view, we might wonder with Rabbi Sachs, Jonathan Sachs, about our moral responsibilities as individuals to a common good of others different from ourselves in wider society and indeed the world. Who do men say that I am? The idea of a selfie society suggests a cultural acceptance and promotion of extreme individualism. The freedom of individuals to be themselves are accorded unquestioned priority, so long as everyone's granted the same freedoms and the safety and security of others are not compromised. When some members of society find these social values difficult to observe, laws may be made to enforce them. The selfie, as I understand it, is very intertwined with social media and with the notion that individuals can portray themselves as they wish to be and to be seen to be, as Anne Horn described ego ideals. Here we come another full circle back to the relationship of ego and ego ideal as an integral aspect of superego function. In the case of narcissism, this is a fragile ego identified with an omnipotently maintained ideal ego. Via the selfie, a person may seek affirming confirmation of the person they wish to be and wish to be seen to be from a social media audience of hundreds and thousands. And here we stumble over the paradox that individual identity is not simply a matter of an individual's choice based on a narcissistic ideal, but is conjointly established with others belonging to a person's social worlds. For example, my identity as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist is not only that I've identified myself as such, but also that I am recognized as such by my profession and my society. Equally, I identify as female because I was born with a body which was identified as female by my significant others, and subsequently my expanding social worlds. The need for others to recognize a person's identity complicates the selfie-oriented idea that individuals can freely choose to be the person they want to be and to be seen to be. A solution to this problem, which seems to have taken hold in Western so-called liberal societies, is the formation of identity political groups. Individuals are eligible to belong to an identity political group when they share an identity characteristic or a cause with which all group members identify. This becomes the identifying feature of the group and constitutes a core or a central component to the identities of the group members. A characteristic, for example, such as sexual orientation, gender identification, skin color, race, body shape, or dietary preference, disability, or an identification with a social issue or concern. The features shared by members of such groupings of individuals will often be associated in past, present, or future with experiences of traumatic suffering perceived in moral terms as social oppression, neglect, and injustice, inflicted by negative discriminatory attitudes of wider society. By creating a politicized group, members gain affirmation from each other of their identity. They can participate in activist pursuits to reinforce that identity characteristic or cause in relation to wider society. Within the aggregated group structure, cohesion is based and maintained on fundamentalist moral processes which ensure that identity group members align closely with the group's political creed. Deviation from the group creed is treated as a moral failure and punished by excommunication. For example, I heard a comedian say, "Riley, I used to be a vegan until I wasn't vegan enough for them." At the interface with wider society, identity political groupings present a massified front, invoking the values of the individualistically oriented liberal society to insist, in morally coercive and fundamentalist terms, their rights as individuals to identify as the person they choose to be and choose to be seen to be. By such weaponized moral means, they can insist that their rights are affirmed by wider society, preferably in law, without question or condition. Such claims unhinge the value of individual freedoms from the responsibilities attendant on exercising one's freedoms to be oneself, that is, to consider and respect those same rights for others in the wider community. Through such morally underpinned claims, an identity political group deploys the wider society's values as leverage against them. They assert their rights as us to be recognized and treated as who we choose to be without question or modification, irrespective of any negative impacts on them. Some of you might recognize Earl Hopper's 1997 theory of the fourth basic assumption in My Choice of Terms to describe these identity political groups as comprising aggregated individuals oscillating with massification processes. Hopper suggested that members of such groups have identities forged out of traumatic experience. These are groups of individuals with fragile, traumatized egos who collectively gain strength by grouping together and protecting their chosen identities with moral force. Anyone who questions and challenges are reacted to as threatening the personal identities of its members. Lost my place. Got it. Even when motivated by a perceived social concern for the safety, protection, and respect for the needs of others of the society. Any perceived threats to that identity are nipped in the bud by moral opprobrium delivered in fundamentalist style. I have an absolute and certain right to be the person I choose to be and to be accepted and protected as such without question or modification, with the subtext, regardless of how this will affect anybody else. Here we can see the identity political group turning a society's individualistic values against the majority in order to fend off perceived threats to the identity claimed by its members. Defense of identity with moral force is vital when this identity gives strength to traumatized, fragile egos of group members. If that identity was to collapse under discussion, the person could end up feeling that they are no one and nothing. The questioner and challenger would swiftly find themselves on the receiving end of the moral outrage typical of Elizabeth Reddish's archaic tyrannical superego processes, mobilized at the social and political level. Threat eliminated. In conclusion, I began this talk by suggesting that the selfie may be seen as a 21st century version of the mythological figure of Narcissus. In such narcissistic moments or states of character, I asked whatever happened to Freud's Überick, that part of the mind that watches over the self. I went on to propose that the leading function of the superego in narcissistic states is an ego ideal unmodified by realities, that is, an ideal ego. Someone with a fragile ego may identify with their ideal ego as a core of their identity, believing that they've got the control and power to choose the person they want to be and to be seen to be. And so long as this identification holds intact, the critical and punitive functions of the superego remain in abeyance. However, when the otherness of reality intrudes and threatens that equation of self with ideal ego, the person's self-preservative aggression is reflexively mobilized to defend the destabilized identity with moral big guns. Self-preservative aggression is channeled through the superego functions of prosecutor, judge, jury, and firing squad, and is turned either on the self or on the threatening other or reality to obliterate it on the righteous grounds of moral failure. I went on to suggest that these moral processes also operate on social and political platforms, especially evident today in our extreme form of individualistic culture. The society's values are invoked and deployed as a second line of defense on the principle of safety in numbers to protect the identities of members of a minority group from being modified in the common interests of the wider society. Aggregated groups are established by individuals grouping together with others who identify with a common characteristic or cause which all members of the group share and which forms a central part of their identity as individuals. These identity groups got lost again. These identity groups attract activist supporters and campaigners who regard these individuals as oppressed by the society in which they live and denied their rights to be the person they have chosen to be. And when the rights of individuals belonging to their identity political group are found to be to negatively impact on the rights of members from the wider society, the social rights claimed may be questioned. And at that point, moral outrage is liable to erupt from the champions of the minority identity political group, invoking social injustice, victimization of the oppressed, and other values of the wider society to kill off the perceived threat to the unstable identity chosen by the group members. In this talk, I've attempted to draw out the superego functions used in narcissistic states of mind and character to fend off realities seen as threatening to a person's narcissistic equilibrium and unstable identity. These moral processes are invoked within a person's relationship with self and others and by groupings in the social and political worlds in which they live. I hope these ideas have offered a sense of the rich potential of Freud's concept of the superego and ways in which it has and can be developed to further our understandings of ourselves, others, and the world around us. Thank you for your attention.
Perhaps at this point I can introduce Elizabeth, and who, as I say, was, and as Celia added, Elizabeth wrote, is the author of The Petrified Ego, and that is also, and has been a contributor to Celia's book, as we said. So I'll hand over to Elizabeth.
Thank you very much, Celia, for that paper. Very, very interesting. I've heard it before, as you know, but it was lovely to hear it again this morning. In response to Celia's paper, I'm going to speak for just 7 or 8 minutes. Firstly, to remind us of the main points, and then to offer some thoughts of my own. So in this paper, which is actually inspired by Dissecting the Superego, Celia has outlined the principal topics of its 12 chapters in 3 sections. Firstly, the psychological development of morality within the individual. Secondly, superego functioning in varying states of mind. And thirdly, superego function in clinical training and practice. In her paper today, she's gone beyond the scope of the book to offer us a view of the ego-superego relationship through the prism, if I might call it that, of narcissism. When she speaks of the selfie, the image that comes to my mind is that classic pose, often with the use of a stick, with the iPhone camera placed where I often imagine my superego to be, just above my head, looking down. And this configuration suggests an alignment of ideal self-image and superego, a mirror held up in celebration of the perfect narcissistic union, reflecting back through cyberspace to admiring and envious eyes on Instagram, Facebook, and the like. As Celia has highlighted, biology shows us that we are social animals. If a member of our species lives a solitary life, essentially it's because they've been ostracized. And the etymology of ostracized, if you've never looked it up, is very, very interesting. It's from the Greek, ostrakon, which means shell, like seashell, or a shard of a pot, on which, when people were voting about unpopular citizens should be banished from the group, the name was written on this shard. So ostracize is a very primitive and primal activity. And to be excluded is still the earliest punishment in universal use. To be ostracized was originally tantamount to death for our ancestors, in the deprivation of access to food and shelter. The concept of the noble savage leading the solitary life in the wilderness is no more than a romantic image. I don't know if you have seen the advert, Sauvage, with Johnny Depp. I mean, it's really quite comical when you look at it from that point of view. Primates live in hierarchically structured groups in which social relationships determine our survival and our reproduction. The book and Celia's paper today have opened up my thinking about how every generation is tasked anew, according to the social and political mores of their formative years, with forging their sense of self against the backdrop of social judgment, perceived and imagined. In examining the relationship between ego and superego across the principal pathologies we encounter in our consulting rooms, this new book, Dissecting the Superego, has very useful things to say, in particular for me, regarding the clinical understanding of borderline personality disorder and perversion. Today, in further examining this relationship through the prism of narcissism, she has shown for me how useful it is in clinical work to keep in mind the fragility of the ego in these pathological presentations. And sometimes this is pretty challenging to bear in mind. A book by a Belgian psychoanalyst, Paul Verhoeven, about the struggle for identity in a market-based society. The original title apparently was Identity. In English, it's been translated as What About Me? I just wanted a short quote. In the classical world, morality was rooted in immanence, the notion that every individual carries within them the seeds of norms and values. By contrast, we're talking big scale history here, Christianity gave rise to the idea of transcendence, where ethics were imposed externally by a divine agency. We are now living, he says, in a time where we have been liberated from priests and the morality they imposed upon us. But this does not mean that we are free. End of quote. I've recently heard social media described as surveillance capitalism. Capitalism being defined as the commercial act of exploiting any resource from which profit can be made. I wonder to myself, what we used to call the individual, has it been transformed by society into a resource for exploitation? It seems that in today's society, what cannot be measured or quantified is deemed worthless by dint of not being measurable or quantifiable. Performance measurement is all. Looking at it from this perspective and thinking about young people today tackling their search for identity, I wonder, is the taking of the selfie actually at an unconscious level a forlorn act, an empty reconstruction of something longed for, in a world where only that which can be expressed in figures or measured has quality? For example, look, here I am with a celebrity. Here I am on the best holiday. Here I am, employee of the month, and sent off to 200 Facebook friends. I'll finish my thoughts with the following: a very different configuration of the selfie, perhaps not the superego of secondary narcissism, a signifier of defiance in the growth of, in the face of emotional growth, but rather an unconscious longing for the fulfilled state of primary narcissism, an attempt to configure the mother's containing gaze, mirroring the individual in mindful reverie.
I want to now bring our meeting to an end. I want to thank everyone for taking part and being here. Thank you to Joanna for supporting the hosting of the meeting, and especially thank you to Elizabeth and to Celia for providing us with an extraordinarily stimulating, inspiring talk this morning, which will leave us with lots to think about. So very many thanks to you all.